good evening and good afternoon to everyone joining from different parts of the world. So, to help us explore and chart out the graph for charitable contributions during and following the global coronavirus pandemic, we have with us two extremely illustrious scholars and practitioners, Dr. Deborah Small and Dr. Kiki Meridu. I hope I got the pronunciation right. Apologies if I
Perfect.
didn't. Okay. So how we'll kind of run this session, we're trying to keep it as informal, as engaging as we possibly can, and we want to keep space for audience questions. For all the panelists, for all the attendees who've joined us, please use the question and answer feature on your webinar, on your screen to add any questions that you may have for our speakers, and we'll try to add them towards the end of the session. We'll start with Dr. Deborah and move on to Dr. Kiki before the audience questions. Dr. Deborah Small is the Laura and John J. Pomerantz Professor for Marketing and Psychology at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. She has received her PhD in Psychology and Behavioral Decision Research from Carnegie Mellon University, and her research interests include charitable giving, consumer judgment, morality, risk assessment, and public policy. In her latest research, she looks at the trends and drives that define how donors choose to support charities and organizations. To talk about this and more, I'm delighted to have Dr. Deborah Small speak with us today. And the floor is yours, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this. It's good, especially being stuck at home without the ability to travel or see colleagues. This feels particularly special to have such an international group of scholars and practitioners participate in this call. I'm sort of dreaming of traveling to all of the places where you guys are staying right now, where you guys are right now. I thought I'd kick it off with just a little bit of an overview by way of background of the way that I think about the area of charitable giving within the context of judgment and decision making and behavioral economics, and why I think it's an important and interesting area to study using the tools of decision making and behavioral economics. So I think probably most on this call are familiar with the kind of the standard assumptions of neoclassic economics, but just by way of background, I think two of the key assumptions are one, that behavior is motivated by self-interest, which of course are immediately interesting when you start thinking about people giving away money to others. So that's one assumption. The other assumption is that people are rational utility maximizers. And so what that means is that decision makers choose what's best for them. And that can be, within the context of self-interest, or we can even forget about the other assumption for a bit and say, maybe they're not self-interested, but we still expect that they're going to choose the best option. So maybe choose the best charity, or figure out the way in which they can do the most social good or produce the best outcome when they're making charity choices. So in contrast to those assumptions, we know a lot from psychology and behavioral decision research and behavioral economics that kind of conflicts with those assumptions. So for one, people are not strictly self-interested. I mean, there's 100-year-old debates in philosophy and psychology and economics, pretty much in every field, about whether there is such a thing as altruism. But even if we kind of punt on that debate, I'm not going to directly address it here today. We know that a lot of human behavior, at least, doesn't appear kind of strictly self-interested. We'll put altruistic in quotation marks, or at least we can describe a lot of human behavior as caring. People are social, they're emotional, and they care for others. I won't go so far as to say that that's pure altruism, but it doesn't look like the way we normally conceive of self-interest. In addition to that, people, when we know a lot in decision-making research across a lot of different areas, that people don't always maximize utility, and that's kind of fundamental in the heuristics and biases tradition from Kahneman and Tversky, that people fail to maximize utility, and it's not just because they're making errors in their decision, but they do so in predictable, systematic, ways. So we can understand, we can predict their behavior, we can explain it in ways that diverge from maximizing utility. And so I won't take much time because I want to leave time for Kiki and lots of time for discussion. But I do want to say about if people aren't maximizing utility and aren't necessarily behaving in their self-interest, what is it that motivates people to engage in charitable giving? And the answer is more than one thing, right? So there are self-interested reasons in which people give to charity, but there are also things that look more caring and altruistic. So in terms of self-interest can come in different forms. So we often think about self-interest as like incentives, monetary rewards, and sometimes those exist for charitable giving, or at least somewhat material rewards, where maybe an organization offers a gift if you donate to charity, or there's tax breaks in some countries for giving to charity. But oftentimes with charitable giving, the more common rewards are not necessarily monetary or material, but they're reputational. And what do I mean by that? Well, in our society, people who are perceived as generous earn status and respect, right? And so their reputations benefit when other people know that they're generous. And so we see a lot of giving motivated by these reputational rewards. When we see, for instance, organizations putting names on buildings of big donors, or in other things like that, producing lists of donors, people posting on social media about the generous deeds that they've performed, things like that. All of those things are kind of pulling on these reputational rewards, that people want to be seen by others as generous people, because it's good for their image, and it helps them make friends. It helps them earn status. It helps them in lots of ways in our social world. The other form of reward, I think that's really important to think about with giving, are the emotional rewards. So it feels good to be nice. I mean, I donated blood the other day, and it was like I just walked out of there with a smile on my face. Like I knew, I was very happy, very pleased to know that I was participating and helping, and somebody in need. It also feels really bad if somebody asks you to give, and you say no, right? And so wanting to avoid those situations can motivate people to behave generously. And so that's just kind of a snapshot of some of the more self-interested reasons why people give to charity. But of course, there are the more caring, or more other, psychologists say, more other-oriented reasons as well. So yes, people tend to be caring. It's hard. If you see somebody suffering, or you read a story of someone suffering, most people feel something, and they feel bad for that person, and they want to kind of relieve that need, or fix that need in some way. But the key thing to note about caring is that our caring is not well aligned with the needs for which our donations could do the most good. So remember, the economic model says we try to maximize utility. Well, our caring system is not focused on maximizing utility. It's just out of sync with that goal. And so it's important, I think, for us to understand, and certainly for fundraisers and organizations to understand what does drive caring, what does make people care. If they're not focused on how they can do the most good, or how they can get the greatest return on their investment, what is causing them to care? And basically, what causes them to care is when something, maybe it's tautological to say a bit, is when something tugs at their heartstrings, or is kind of personally meaningful or emotionally evocative to them. And so what are those things? Well, we tend to feel much more strongly towards victims and causes that are physically close to us, when we can actually kind of see them, see their faces, know a little bit about them, have something in common with them, things like that. And that's obviously, we're on this remarkably international call right now, and that's a huge, I think, challenge for thinking about international aid, where people aren't necessarily naturally feeling sympathetic for victims that are totally different from them, from a different culture, far away, they have no contact with them or no little understanding of what they're going through. People are also care more when they have personal experience with a particular misfortune. So if you've lived through a hurricane, then you're going to naturally feel more sympathetic towards other victims of hurricanes, even if you don't know those, you never meet them, you have no contact with them at all, they're far away. That common experience draws us closer to others, even when we don't know them. And finally, we are more caring when we have a specific identifiable victim. There's a particular person in need who tugs at our heartstrings, much more so than more statistical victims. So, when organizations kind of post a lot of data and talk, very quantitatively about really, people don't respond well to that information. They respond much better to a single case, a single victim. And that's a ploy that I think many organizations and journalists understand well when they open up with a picture of a small child who will tug at their heartstrings, or journalists tell a story of a particular case. That's what draws the human response. Of course, the downside of that is that it often leads to kind of inefficient allocation of aid, because famous story, near her home in Texas in the I think 1986 or 1987, and she just became this media sensation overnight. And people around the world sent money to her family for her rescue effort, and she was in fact rescued. And now she's kind of famous. There's a TV movie about her and all this, but she also sits on this large trust fund now of hundreds of thousands of dollars, all the aid that was sent to her family. And so, the story of baby Jessica is famous because in some sense it's a demonstration of how generous and caring people can be. People all over the world who didn't know this girl, didn't know her family, had no connection to her, felt something and wanted to support her. But on the other hand, if you think about how many people could have been helped if, instead of allocating that money to that one person, it had been distributed to places where, maybe in the developing world, where it's pretty cheap to save a life, and we could save a lot more lives than just that one person. And so that, I think, is a good demonstration of how our caring kind of isn't well aligned with where we can maximize, do the most good, save the most lives. And that's, I think, a real challenge for thinking about giving. So maybe I'll stop there and pass the torch to Kiki, and I look forward to the rest of this session.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Deb. I think I might build off on what you said. The self-interest bit and what drives giving and caring. I also see it as, we call it supporter identity, which is, it could be your gender, it could be your location, it could be based on an experience you just had, a cancer survivor, for example. So you have that identity that could drive motivation to give to a specific cause. And so that drives caring, to relate it back to what you were saying. But also maybe it's the self-interest bit, because you express your values and who you are, which makes you feel great. As you said, you feel great about giving blood, but you also feel great about supporting a cause that aligns with your beliefs. So that was my comment to everything you just shared, and I agree 100% with all of that. And should I mention COVID? I don't know. I'm so happy that you didn't, because even though we're here to talk about the differences between the before and after COVID period, yes, there are differences, of course. Like face-to-face fundraising, it can't happen. You can't come to contact with anyone. And yes, some charities saw an increase in revenue, especially those in the front line. But in my view, there is no difference. And everything is the same. Why? Because there is no difference in the way that charities operate. And there is no difference in the fundraising strategy. And the part that I mentioned, supporter identity, it's ignored now as much as it was ignored before COVID. And that's what drives giving, because COVID is just another emergency, no matter how tragic and widespread, and it's very global, but it's just another emergency. And yes, some people give to emergencies, but that has always been the case, whether it's a natural disaster or now this case. And the charity's job is to be able to distinguish which of these supporters that flood in during an emergency are giving because of the emergency and they won't give again to the cause in the future, probably not in a consistent manner, and which supporters have some sort of connection and affinity to the cause, and they have the potential to become committed supporters. So yeah, I think this was the main point that I needed to make, that I don't see a difference in the way charities operate. That crucial information about supporters is missed, when you could easily imagine a reality where every time someone signs up and becomes a donor, you ask them about their connection to the cause, and you capture that information, and then how you speak to them in the future changes because of that. And all your operations should be based on all of this. And this isn't just theory, and it's not like a vague concept that couldn't possibly be applied. We've done this work before with our clients, where of course it starts with a research project, because for each charity there's going to be different identities that matter. So it always starts with research, but once you've identified the identity that matters and the question that measures it, then you should start using it in every conversation you have with supporters. Just one example, we did some work with a conservation charity in the UK, and we discovered the identities that matter for them and how to measure it. And in that case, people were supporting that charity either to protect birds and just birds. If you talk to them about butterflies, they switched off. And there were people who were supporting the same charity to protect all nature. So it's not a matter of one being a better supporter than the other. They were both good types of supporters. It's just that their motivation was different. So you needed to talk to them differently. And we wanted to test in market whether by doing that, by talking to them differently, we could affect their giving. So we intervened in an inbound call. Supporters were calling in to participate in an activity that the charity was doing. And of course, while they're on the phone, the fundraiser also asks them if they want to become a monthly supporter. What we did is we changed the script to start with a question: are you a bird enthusiast or a nature enthusiast? And people could self-identify. There is no reason why they couldn't answer this question very quickly and honestly, and actually with enthusiasm, because it's about themselves. And once we got that answer, we tailored the rest of the script to reflect who they are. So when we were asking them to become a member and to give monthly to protect birds or nature, we would tailor that to their identity. And we would talk about the impact on birds, but we would also talk about the benefits. You can come to the reserves and see birds or nature. And by doing that, we saw a 15% increase in conversion rate and an increase in value by £10, if I remember correctly. So this is outside of COVID, but the same principle applies if you were to talk about COVID, how COVID affected nature or birds. So COVID is almost an irrelevant factor that just changes how you talk about the cause. You frame it differently. It doesn't change the substance of the cause. So this kind of tailoring based on motivation is what needs to happen, and it hasn't happened. So unless fundraising strategy changes to start capturing and using these supporter insights, we won't see real sustainable difference. And any fluctuations in giving that we observe now is random or based on factors that have nothing to do with the underlying motivation to give. And I'll stop here for questions.
Thank you so much for both your points, and I mean, it's very evident from the way the passion and the knowledge with which Kiki speaks. But I did miss out on introducing her, so I'm going to. We thought we were gonna, introduce you and then have you speak, but. Dr. Kiki is the Chief Behavioral Scientist at Donor Voice in London. Donor Voice helps nonprofit organizations to grow and optimize fundraising programs through development and implementation of integrated solutions. She has a PhD from City University of London, and she has wide experience across organizations integrating behavioral science and marketing communications for a number of client organizations, including charities and financial organizations. So as you both have said, and you've pointed out some very important points, and I'm just going to quickly, round them up. So, it's a jumping off point for our questions from the audience. We have a few, and we encourage our attendees to add any other questions that they may have. Dr. Deb, you spoke about the inherent dilemma in how neoclassical economic models we put that emphasis on self-interest and how conventionally we think of charity, and how the idea of a rational utility maximization, you know, homo economicus model of man doesn't really always align with what we have in mind, and how our rewards are often reputational and emotional, coming out of the fact that as human beings we all care. We care about the causes which come out of our common experiences of people, of our communities, and the stories we see around us, and how individual storytelling often moves us to a point where we're we kind of jump to not, I wouldn't say defense for but to kind of help and to make sure that we're doing something, because it really at the end of the day it does address a little bit of our own self-interest. Dr. Kiki, you spoke about how the one of the basic how COVID hasn't changed a lot in terms of the operation manual for charities, considering that it's a lot of logistics that may have changed, that people don't have to meet each other face to face, but there's still the basic things that people are not looking at in terms of sustainable change in the way that charitable donations are looked at, is that we don't always take the time to find those inherent motivations and drives that people have. And if that exercise is done, it often leads to a much smoother track. So that was just to quickly sum up what we spoke about so far, and I'm going to take this opportunity to quickly ask Anisha and I had questions that we would like to pose to you before we move on to the audience questions. Anisha, do you want to take the first question?
Sure. I think that was super interesting and touched upon some thoughts we had before as well. I think to either of you, and both of you touched on it a little bit, I think on the survivor identity and how do you make it relatable. So I think so far, if you want to get people to contribute, one way is obviously to make subjects relatable, and that's why we see so many individual stories of potential beneficiaries on portals or websites of charity organizations. But in this case, sort of COVID has affected everyone, right, in some form or the other. So I just wonder whether you still think tapping into relatability and empathy is still the best option, or are there any other emotions or psychologies that you think would work at this point to prompt people to give more?
Do you mean specifically to give to victims of COVID?
Yeah, or like in general in the future when we talk about, like, it's not just COVID, right? But for emergencies that affect everybody, and you can't build that relatability to just one person, what is the best strategies to go about that?
I mean, I think in some sense that's there's other issues, of course, but in some sense that's the context is doing the work for you. So rather than you needing to message to or target to build that relatability, the common experience of this pandemic across the world does it for you. It makes all of us or humanity seem more of or our group seem more of a commonality rather than a difference. Of course, there are other things going in the way, like a lot of lost income, the economic downturns, and people focusing more on their loved ones if people in their family are sick or struggling in different ways. So there are other factors as well. But I do think it's it's like a bright spot of the globalness of the pandemic is that it reminds us all that we're all the same.
Yeah, I agree. The fact that it touches everyone around the world doesn't negate the use of empathy. It means you can talk to anyone because everyone will relate. So you can definitely use that. However, the reason why it works is because you draw on a personal experience. I've also gone through that. I know what it feels like. That's what empathy is. And again, COVID is just this thing that happened that changes how charities should be talking about the cause. COVID is not a cause. COVID is the pandemic that happened that affects different causes. So what charities should be talking about is the cause. So a food bank still should talk about food shortages under the light of COVID. And a health charity should talk about the people who have that health condition and how COVID made them even more vulnerable. So again, it's just an added thing on top of the cause. And since that's the case, then I'm referring back to what I said earlier. The other way to create connection and bring it home is to know people's motivations and connection to the cause, because beneficiary stories are great. But going back to the cancer survivor example, if I'm a cancer survivor and you knock on my door and you ask me to donate by using a stranger's experience and not my own, why? That's a missed opportunity. Ask me if I have a connection and draw on my experience to help others like me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think that, just a quick follow-up, do you think that creates a thought process that, okay, if in this case, and we like using maybe the light of COVID or not, that there would be, because everyone can relate, there would be other people contributing. So why should I personally contribute? Do you think like there might be some of that challenge that comes in where I don't feel incentivized, or like I sort of free ride on the idea that, well, this affects everyone, so everyone must be contributing. Maybe I don't have to do for this case. Do you think there's any motivation behind that?
Diffusion of responsibility. Yeah. Deb, you wanted to say something?
Yes, there's forces that work in both directions. So there's potential for diffusion of responsibility, but at the same time, we know that social norm information is really powerful. And so if you say most people in your neighborhood are voting, then you get more people going out to vote than if you say not enough people are voting. And so I would hope that same principle would apply in this case too, is that knowing that especially lots of people like you are supporting causes should increase rather than decrease giving. Of course, that's all else equal, and things are definitely not all else equal right now. There's a lot of things changing all the time.
Sorry, so I have one question that came from how, in fact, the key message from both your discussions. Deb, you spoke about how there is this kind of inherent pull in the causes that we care about and the causes that we feel that quote unquote tug at our heartstrings, and then there are causes, like you said, there's not often the most resource efficient allocation of the money that goes in, or the donations that go into a particular cause. So considering that there is on the one end of a spectrum, if we consider this a spectrum, on the one end when there is this kind of rational way of greater impact and greater benefit to a more number of people, or there is the opportunity to do something maybe just for one person, like in the case of Jessica, for example, now that she has a trust fund, of really supporting this one person with a great amount because that's how much it moved you. Is there a middle ground to be reached, where so like Kiki said, if we do that exercise of identifying drives and motivations in people, is there a path that goes from there to coming to a middle ground where you are still working on causes, but you're also kind of making sure that it goes into ways, and projects where there's more benefit to everyone. And this is a question to both of you, because this is how, like, what is that kind of road that charities and organizations can look at to get there?
Sure. No, that's a great question. There's definitely a potential for some middle ground. One of the things that I know probably many in the call are familiar with this is that there's this growing movement called the effective altruism movement, which inspired by the philosopher Peter Singer, which kind of argues that we have an ethical responsibility to donate money if we are, relatively rich in the world. Most people in the West are. Um, we have an ethical responsibility to give, and we should give in ways that have the greatest impact. And so, prior to this movement, even if you had those values, even if you were kind of an unusual human who was a little maybe more like Homo economicus in some ways, although not self-interested, and wanted to give a lot, but wanted to do so in the most with the greatest return on investment. If you prior to this movement, even if you wanted to do that, it's really hard to figure that out where you should donate your money. It's not, charities are certainly not advertising the return on investment and or calculating it in any way. But in recent years, there's been really a lot of progress in kind of developing common metrics for impact, and publicizing, making those metrics transparent through organizations like GiveWell and Life You Can Save and others, to allow people to make that easier, essentially. But what we found in our research is that even when you give people these comparative effectiveness metrics, most people don't use them. And the reason they don't use them is related to things that we were discussing before, is that they want to help certain causes more than others, and they're willing. It's not that they don't care about impact, it's just that they don't care as much, or they're willing to sacrifice some degree of impact to choose a cause that they feel something for. But it's not as I said, it's not that they don't care about impact at all. So you asked about a middle ground. If you give them options of different organizations to support, that each support a cause that they care about, and you give them the information on how much impact each of those organizations can do, then they'll pick the organization that does the most impact, condition on it supporting the cause that they care about. And so there may be the middle ground, right? Is recognize human psychology and that motive that I think Kiki described so nicely, to identify really strongly with a cause, but then kind of guide them towards ways within that cause, guide them toward ways to spend their money most efficiently. The economist Dean Carlin has a nice saying. He says, encourage donors to pick a cause with their heart and an organization with their mind. And I think sums it up nicely, and perhaps is the most broadly attractive policy. That's not to say that I'm a big supporter of effective altruism. I think it's great, and I try to give myself personally to the most effective causes. And there's a smallish subset of people who really endorse the values of that. But I think it's not. I'm skeptical that will ever be a mainstream way in which people think about giving, because it's just quite counter to our natural psychology.
I honestly have very few to add to this, because I don't want to repeat everything you just said. So I agree fully with all of that. People choose a cause because they relate to it, and then maybe you can give them effectiveness, efficiency ratings, that might work. but they're not available, they're not easily digestible, comparable, and all of that. Now, the other problem, which is the new information that hopefully I'm adding, is the way fundraising happens. And in our lives, usually there are cases where you sit down and you try to find a cause to give to, where the whole process is your own. So you start looking at organizations, but also there's a lot of cases that you're approached by a specific organization from a specific cause, and it's a decision, it's a binary decision. You don't have choice. You don't have a choice of the same type of cause, just different organizations, and you say, yeah, I want to go with that one. You're approached by one organization and it's a yes or no answer. So that also needs to change, so that people can start including impact criteria. Maybe technology will help. There are apps now that you can choose organizations to support. Maybe that's the future.
That's really great insight, because it's true. I think, like you said, I mean, I'm imagining myself being given options, and I think that makes it easier to choose. I think we'll get started with audience questions. I believe Anisha has the first one.
Yeah, I have a few. So one of the questions that came in was, to your point of COVID is just right now, but we shouldn't be linking everything to that. Do you think charitable giving can be sticky, and do you believe that people can form a habit out of giving to charities over a period of time, rather than just one-off for a particular emergency or particular case?
Sorry, is this
Kiki, take that.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, the spotlight shouldn't be on COVID or any type of emergency or situation. The spotlight should be on the supporter. And there will always be supporters that give because of a specific situation. And so they might give to a cause because a natural disaster happened. And because they want to keep supporting for that emergency, they give to a different cause. But these are not supporters that an organization can rely on. However, there are also supporters that they will give in the long term. They give all year and they give during the emergency. And we don't need to do anything for that to happen. It happens organically. These people feel connected to that cause and they want to help. So yes, they do have the longer term view in mind. I'm not sure I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I hope so. Debbie, did you have anything to add, or should we move to the next question?
I'll just add, I mean, I think this is also an opportunity when you think about kind of long-term or repeated giving. We know a lot in decision-making and behavioral economics from other areas besides giving about how to get people to kind of pre-commit in advance, or so for instance, there's some research on using this. People in this call are probably familiar with the Save More Tomorrow plan of Bernard C. and Thaler, to get people to kind of commit to increasing their retirement savings as their income goes up. There's been some similar work with donations, where you get people to pre-commit in advance to to kind of budget for charity every year, and to increase their budget as they earn more throughout their lives. And so I think that anytime we can do that, then we make giving kind of more automatic. People don't have to think about it, and so it's not so much a habit that they, but it's an automatic part of their budget that doesn't feel as costly to them, because they've already kind of taken it out of their plans, and so they're not thinking about, oh, I might spend this on an extra vacation or a nicer car or home or something like that, because it's budgeted aside.
That's very interesting. I think that's true. Default options often make it easier for us to follow through, as do commitment devices, I think. So the next audience question that we have for you is, how do we appeal to people who identify themselves as an out group to those who donate to a certain cause? If so, a social norm message is unlikely to have an effect. What else might work?
I mean, I would say in that case, just pick different people to target, right? So that seems like Kiki was speaking about, understanding donors and figuring out what's good for them. I think another, complementary approach is to pick the donors that you think in advance are going to be most likely to be supporters. And so rather than trying to, find a way to talk to people that are unlikely to support you, try to find the people that are more likely to support you.
Yeah, targeting plays a huge role. But the only other thing I can think of, if someone identifies as an out group, is to take a step back and find an even larger category. So I'm Greek, you're an American, we're both human beings. So taking a step back and find a bigger category where we both belong, maybe that'll work. But the how we apply this depends on the specifics.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The other one that's come through from the audience is that in a pandemic situation, when everyone is feeling vulnerable, what would motivate to make that trade-off, to give up something to help somebody else who's more vulnerable, even though I myself might be feeling insecure about tomorrow?
I can try to take this, or at least kick it off. So kind of classic in psychology is that we evaluate our own state by comparing ourselves to reference points, right? And so those reference points could be like how I was 6 months ago, in which case I might be feeling very vulnerable because maybe I have, professional instability or health, for whatever reason, most of us are comparatively worse off than we were, or perceive ourselves as worse off than the reference point of, say, 6 months ago. But another really critical reference point is other people. And so if we start comparing ourselves to those who are even worse off or even more vulnerable than we are, even if, then suddenly we feel pretty good about ourselves. We feel pretty in control and pretty well off. And so I think that's what needs to happen, is that we need to get people to make those social comparisons and recognize their kind of comparative wealth and comparative advantage and utility, and that's how I think that's the key to your question. I'm not sure exactly how to apply that, but I think that's the underlying psychology there.
Yeah, and I think that, again, broken record here, that's another similarity. People make these trade-offs all the time, even before COVID. Some people are not so well off and still they give to charity, so they're willing to make that trade-off. For example, in legacy giving, we think that only rich people leave a legacy gift or a gift in the will, but actually people that are not so wealthy might be willing to leave a percentage of their estate to a charity they love. And again, that's a trade-off that happens based on the psychology that Deb explained, but it's not COVID specific. It happens, and it happened every day before that.
Yeah, I think that's true. We have another question that says, how do we motivate donors to donate for important causes that don't necessarily have an identifiable victim, but rather donating to advocacy and movements or causes that are more long-term in nature, such as changing norms in a community on gender violence, for example?
I mean, I think it's true that some causes more lend themselves more to using an identifiable victim appeal. But I think even in those, certainly in those cases, I think there's always a person behind every issue. And so I don't think it's crazy to come up to kind of get into the lives of people who are affected by those causes and describe them, or provide anecdotes. So I don't think I think it's a fixable challenge.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I've always found ways working with clients to find not an identifiable victim always, but at least a story, because that's what the identifiable victim does. It tells a story of a person in need. So you can shift that somehow to talk about a very specific need and not a wider scale of the problem with statistics and numbers, but present it in a more emotional, tangible way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Somebody has a follow-up question. I think we'll do that, and then we can do a maybe last one or two. It says, pertaining to the topic of repeated giving, is there a barrier of reduced emotional rewards from repeated giving? For example, I don't feel as good when I do the action of giving money the first time as when it gets deducted from my account, supposing you set up like a default or something of that sort. And then do you think that barrier exists? And if so, is there anything that you think people are doing to overcome it?
I think that's the beauty of automatizing that behavior by setting up in advance, is that you don't need to rely on that continued emotional response. And so I think that's the solution there is take the psychology out of it, take the need for that motive out of it, because the pre-commitment has already, the decision is passed, and people are going to be unlikely to retract on their prior commitments, because that will be, that's unpleasant in its own way, especially like it feels like it's taking money away from needy people. It's not something that most people are going to want to do.
That's a very great question, and it's an unanswered question that I have when it comes to regular donors, which it's similar to what we're saying here with a pre-commitment. So typically what charities are doing is they thank donors, monthly donors, every month. And the question is, does this help or hurt? Does reminding that every month you give money brings that pain of paying, or does it bring back the warm glow of giving? And does it lead to cancellations, or it helps with retention? We don't know. No one has tested this. So that would be one project that I would love to do. Deb, maybe we can do it together.
We should talk.
It's wonderful when these kind of ideas come together. I have one more question, I think, before we'll take the final one. One of the audience questions is, when there's an overwhelming number of urgent causes, and I guess we can take the current situation as an example, how can we motivate donors to our particular cause?
Oh man, that's a hard one. I mean, I think you got to kind of be the best marketer that you can. You've got to use. It really comes down to like cutting through the clutter. But it's more than that in this case too, because people might feel sort of overwhelmed by. I know I feel overwhelmed by the various needs and around, and sort of feel like even if you can help with one cause, so what? There's so many other needs. Maybe my aid will only feel like a drop in the bucket given the needs. So I don't have. I wish that's like the $1 million question that that's really important, but it's also, I think that's really hard. And so we should, I think, be honest and recognize that that's going to be really hard.
That's fair. I didn't think it would. I mean, you're right. It is $1 million question. I guess literally. Anisha, I believe you have one more.
Yeah, of course. I think we wanted to close with some things that have come up when you decided what future research areas could look like. So I think the question is around, what are some of the unanswered research questions in applying behavioral science or psychology to charitable giving, and what would you personally, both of you, I guess, be most interested in studying or testing out, or where do you think the gaps in our understanding are so far?
Do you want to go first? I've been going first.
Again, it's everything I shared today, it hasn't been tested. We're starting to test this with a few clients, but trying to uncover supporter motivation, capturing it in the database, playing it back, creating journeys or experiences based on their motivation. That's what I'm really interested in seeing, if that will have an impact in fundraising, because right now it's not happening.
I could probably talk for another hour about questions I'd like to study. I'll just mention a few. So one, we talked a little bit about effective altruism, and I'm quite interested in like figuring out what sorts of personality traits and demographic traits lead people to kind of convert to that approach. And so that's one thing we're looking at. Another area that we haven't really touched on here, we've been talking about kind of individual donors, but a huge trend now with businesses is that businesses and brands are expected to participate in philanthropy and cause marketing, and the customers often reward them for this and want to support brands and buy from brands that are engaged in causes that they support. And so we see a lot of like even activism among companies engaging in different issues. And so I think there's a lot of interesting questions there about how people think about a corporation, which is supposed to be, all about self-interest, profit maximization, that's engaging in good, and when that works and when it doesn't. And so I'm quite interested in that area as well.
I think these are both some super interesting fields, testing out because these are such questions that we often talk about and there's no way to know. And it's been so hard to find the right questions to ask and the right metrics to measure them by. But like you said, to find out what motivations work, and that again, that inherent dilemma between self-interest and donations. So I mean, we really look forward to both of your research as and when we're acquainted with it. But we just wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. We'll just wind up, but on behalf of our attendees and behalf of Busara and IBEN, thank you so much. This was a very, very engaging talk. I personally learned a lot. This isn't a field that I was very acquainted with for the longest time, but on reading and on listening to you, there's so much interesting so many interesting things here. And I hope that we get to speak with you both again. If you have any final thoughts, the floor is open, but otherwise, thank you so much for your time. And I hope you both have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Take care, everybody.
Bye. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.